Story 1. Hi, my name is Isla, and today I'm going to share the most terrifying experience that happened to me on Halloween night in 2022 here in Scotland. My friends and I were ready for a quiet night, but what happened that evening changed everything. It was a cold, cloudy night with a chilling wind that cut through the skin. Those heavy clouds seemed to suffocate any light the moonlight tried to spread. We decided to gather at my friend Rory's house, which is in a remote part of town, almost in the middle of nowhere. The house, which looked like something out of a horror story, had been in his family for generations, and now it was just him and his grandfather living there. A place too quiet, surrounded by dense forest, which that night seemed alive, whispering dark secrets through its twisted trees. We were all inside, trying to create a fun atmosphere, eating candy and laughing at the typical Halloween silliness. But the feeling that something was wrong began to fill the air as the wind outside grew stronger. It was as if the night's shadows were closing in on the house, pressing against the walls, wanting to come in. Outside, all we could hear was the rustling of the trees and, occasionally, the distant rumble of thunder. But inside the house, there was absolute silence. Before we go any further with more scary stories, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel and give a thumbs up if you're enjoying the content. Your engagement is crucial for us to keep uncovering mysteries that challenge our reality. Don't forget to comment below which city you're watching from, so we know how far our stories are reaching. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and then we heard it. Two sharp, firm knocks at the door. The sound echoed through the room, sending chills down our spines. We all exchanged glances, trying to figure out if it was a prank. Who would knock on such a remote house on Halloween? I thought. Rory got up, went to the door, but no one was there. Just emptiness, darkness, and the wind. We sat back down, trying to ignore the discomfort that had already started to settle in. Minutes later, the knocking returned, this time with a force that shattered the silence of the night like breaking glass. The knocks were deliberate, heavy, as if whoever or whatever was outside knew we were already terrified. Rory stared at the door, eyes wide, too scared to move. And then, the laughter began. They weren't normal laughs. They weren't joyful or the sound of a joke. They were children's laughter, high-pitched, distorted, like they'd been pulled from the depths of a nightmare. There was something wrong with those laughs. They didn't echo like something made of flesh and blood. They were like whispers from another world. Each laugh seemed to be followed by a whisper from something we couldn't see, but could feel closing in around us. Those giggles made my skin crawl in a way I'd never felt before, like cold hands touching my neck. We looked out the window, hoping to see something, anything. But all we could see was the swaying trees in the darkness and the light rain starting to fall, creating ghostly trails on the window glass. The shadows seemed to move in ways we couldn't explain. I swear, for a brief moment, I saw something or someone moving among the trees, but when I blinked, it was all gone again. George, always trying to keep calm, thought it would be a good idea to light a candle. Fire keeps mischievous spirits away, he said with a forced smile, trying to hide the fear he couldn't mask. He grabbed a thick candle, one of those we use in emergencies, and placed it near the door, lighting it with trembling hands. As soon as the flames started to glow, something even stranger happened. The candle, which should have burned steadily, began to flicker violently, as if it was caught in a strong wind. But all the windows were closed. There was no draft. It was as if something invisible was playing with the flame, trying to extinguish it, yet keeping it lit just to taunt us. The tension inside the house became unbearable. Every passing second felt like torture. The knocking on the door continued, now even stronger, almost demanding. And the laughter. Those damn laughs didn't stop. It was like the children, or whatever they were circling the house, laughing at us, savoring our fear. I could feel the terror taking over my body, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would explode. My hands were shaking so much that I could barely hold the glass of water I had picked up to calm myself. Then, the most disturbing thing happened. The candle, which kept flickering, began to move on its own. No, the flame didn't just flicker. The base of the candle slid slowly across the table, as if an invisible hand was dragging it. The panic, already unbearable, reached a new level. No one touched the candle, but there it was, sliding as if someone or something was manipulating it. Rory tried to act rationally. He approached slowly, and before he could do anything, the candle went out. The silence that followed was worse than the laughter. It was a thick, suffocating silence that seemed to fill the space around us. The only sound was our breathing, heavy and fast. We tried to stay calm, but we knew something was wrong, terribly wrong. And then the knocking stopped. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it had started. We stood there, frozen with fear, unable to move or speak, staring at the door. None of us dared to check if something was outside. We decided to lay down together in the living room, huddled like a pack of terrified animals. We tried to sleep, but none of us could relax. Every little sound seemed amplified. Time passed painfully slowly until, somehow, our bodies gave into exhaustion, and we fell asleep, though the fear pulsed through each of us.
When the first faint ray of sunlight came through the window, we woke up. That momentary relief of daylight was soon replaced by something even more disturbing. Rory's grandfather was sitting at the table, calmly eating, as if the previous night had been just a dream. We told him everything, desperate for an explanation, anything that made sense. And then, he just looked at us with a disturbingly calm expression and said, "Oh that? Don't worry. When the candle flickers, and you hear laughter, it's just the smiling ghosts. They come out to socialize on Halloween nights." Silence filled the room. No one dared to speak. The casual way he said that made my blood run cold. It was as if this was normal for him, as if it had happened many times before. I never went back to that house. And to this day, every time I hear children's laughter or see a candle flicker for no reason, I feel the weight of that night on me. The question that haunts me since then is, who was really knocking on that door that night? And why have they never stopped smiling? Story 2. My name is John, and even now, 24 years later, I'm still trying to understand what really happened on Halloween night in the year 2000. I was only 11 years old at the time, but the fear of that night still haunts me like a shadow, and to be honest, I might never uncover the truth. It was a typical Halloween for a boy my age. I was excited, wearing a makeshift skeleton costume, and eager to go to a party at my friend Tom's house, which wasn't too far from where I lived. The party was full of kids in costumes, and everything seemed like harmless Halloween fun. Candy, pranks, and a few games to scare the younger kids. The weather outside was terrible. The sky was thick with heavy, dark clouds, signaling a coming storm, and from time to time, distant thunder rumbled. Around 9 p.m., heavy rain started pouring down, hammering against the windows of Tom's house. The party began to wind down, and I was anxiously waiting for my mom to pick me up, but as the hours passed, she still hadn't arrived. The other kids started to leave, and the place was emptying out. I kept looking out the window, expecting to see her car, but there were no lights or headlights in sight. After a while, I decided I had waited long enough. In my head, 3 blocks to my house didn't seem like a big deal, and I figured I could handle a little rain. I told Tom and headed out into the storm. The wind was so strong it felt like it was trying to push me back inside, but I kept going, determined to get home as quickly as possible. On the second block, that's when I saw her. A hunched figure, standing under an old flickering streetlight, dressed in dark clothes, almost like a witch from a fairy tale. The old woman had thin, scraggly white hair, and her wrinkled skin looked almost translucent under the dim light. She was watching me. My steps faltered, but before I could decide what to do, she spoke with a raspy, almost melodic voice. "Boy, it's raining hard. Come take shelter at my house until it passes." Every part of my body screamed for me to say no and run, but something in her gaze, in those gnarled hands reaching toward me, froze me in place. Maybe it was the cold, maybe the exhaustion, or maybe I was just too curious to resist. What could go wrong, after all? She seemed like a harmless old lady, and I was soaked to the bone. Her house wasn't far. It was an old building with large, dark windows, and it looked like it was on the verge of collapse. When I entered, the smell of mold and burnt candles surrounded me. The air was heavy, as if it had been stagnant for decades. The house was dark, with only a few candles scattered around, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. She led me to a small room where there was a worn wooden chair. The old woman offered me a seat, and I accepted, even though every fiber of my being told me to leave as quickly as possible. She handed me an old towel, and as I dried my face, I noticed something strange on the table in front of me, a thick book with a black cover and a gold-engraved symbol. It was a pentagram. My breath caught in my throat. I had never seen something like this up close, but I had heard stories. This wasn't just any book. A feeling of dread grew inside me. I wanted to ask what it was, but before I could say anything, the old woman disappeared through a side door, muttering something I couldn't understand. I was left there, alone, staring at the book. Something was calling me to open it, an almost irresistible curiosity, but I knew I shouldn't. I tried to resist, but my hands were trembling with anxiety. Slowly, I stood up and took a step toward the book. That's when I heard it. Avispa. Faint at first, barely perceptible, as if it were coming from deep within the house. I froze. The whisper grew louder, like multiple voices blending into a macabre chant. My heart pounded in my chest, and just as I gathered the courage to move, the candle closest to me was extinguished by an invisible breath. Panic set in. I turned toward the door the old woman had left through, but it remained closed, wrapped in its eerie silence. The whispering continued to grow, and now it seemed to come from all directions, enveloping, unsettling. The walls of the house seemed to close in around me, as if the place were alive, breathing with me. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I needed to get out of there. I walked back toward the front door, but it was locked. I tried turning the knob, pulling, pushing, but nothing happened. Then, I heard the laughter. It was low, a weak, raspy laugh that echoed down the hallway. I turned, and there she was, the old woman, standing at the end of the hallway, just watching me with those cold, empty eyes. She didn't move, but something in her gaze told me I was trapped. Slowly, she raised her hand and pointed at the book. "You opened it, didn't you?" she said, her voice now deeper and more menacing. I hadn't touched the book, but something in her words made me feel guilty, as if just looking at it had been a fatal mistake. The whispering intensified, the walls began to shake, and a deadly cold filled the room. The candles flickered wildly, and I could see shadows dancing around me, as if they were moving on their own. The air grew thick, almost impossible to breathe, and all I could do was run. I ran toward the window, hoping to escape, but before I could reach it, everything went black. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up the next morning, lying in the middle of the street, soaked and trembling. The old woman, the house, the book. Everything had disappeared. I ran home, without looking back. When I told my parents, they thought I had dreamt it, but I knew it had happened. Curious to understand what had happened, I went back to the spot the next day, but the house simply wasn't there anymore. Where the old eerie building had been, there was now just an empty, overgrown lot. I asked the neighbors, but no one seemed to remember a house ever being there. It was as if it had never existed. Since then, I've never been able to forget that night. Sometimes, in my worst nightmares, I still see the old woman, standing at the end of the hallway, watching me with those cold, empty eyes. And I always wonder, what would have happened if I had opened the book? Maybe I'll never know. But what I do know is that night changed my life forever. And to this day, on Halloween, I avoid walking alone. Story 3. My name is Clarice, and the story I'm about to tell is something my family kept secret for many years. For decades, my mother and brothers refused to talk about what happened that Halloween night in the 1960s. I only learned the full details when I was already an adult, and since then, I've never been able to shake off the fear of that night. Today, as I look back, I feel like I'm reliving every moment, as if the events of that dark night are still etched in my mind. On that Halloween, I was only 17 years old. I was a young girl, full of life and hope, but also surrounded by the superstitions that permeated our small town. I remember it like it was yesterday. My parents, my two brothers, and I were returning home after a Halloween dinner at some relative's house. The night was cold, and the wind cut like blades, making the darkness seem even denser. I was sitting in the back seat with my brothers, while my parents exchanged few words in the front. The road was long, narrow, and snaked through a forest that seemed to come alive and breathe at night. Everything was enveloped in a deep silence, interrupted only by the sound of the car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves. Then it began. I was looking out the window, watching the trees pass by like shadows, when something moved in the darkness. Something big, fast. At first, I thought it was an illusion caused by the speed of the car and my exhaustion, but what I saw next froze my blood. There was something out there, flying alongside the car, keeping up with our speed. It was a humanoid figure, but its body was elongated and slim in a way that didn't seem natural. It had wings, large and black, like those of a bat, and the most terrifying thing of all, its eyes. Red, fire-like eyes that glowed intensely in the darkness, fixed on us. I screamed, and immediately, my brothers started looking out the window, only to see the same thing I had seen. My mother turned to look, and her eyes widened in fear. My father, realizing the panic growing in the car, stepped on the gas, trying to escape the creature. But it was still there, flying beside us, almost touching the window, as if it were watching us, hunting us. That creature was not a bird, and it was definitely not human. Its wings flapped in a way that sounded wrong, and its piercing red eyes gleamed with a supernatural intensity. As the car gained speed, the creature came even closer, as if it were enjoying our fear. My mother began to pray aloud, but the words came out trembling, almost inaudible. We knew that what we were facing wasn't of this world. And then, out of nowhere, the creature made a sound. A high-pitched, shrill scream that didn't seem to come from a human or animal throat. It was the sound of pure terror, something that penetrated your mind and made you feel utterly powerless. I remember starting to cry, and my mother was gripping my hand so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. My father kept driving like a madman, the car shaking violently as it took the curves in the road, but the creature wouldn't stop. At one point, it started hitting the windows, as if it were trying to get inside the car. Then suddenly, it vanished. For a moment, the silence returned. We were all trembling, trying to comprehend what had just happened. My father finally stopped the car in front of our house, and we ran inside, desperate for the safety of our home. But what happened next was even more terrifying. When we got inside, my older brother Tom separated from us and went out to the backyard to retrieve something he had left there earlier. He was only 15 at the time and had always been too curious for his own good. I remember my mother shouting for him to come back inside, but he was determined to get whatever it was. What happened next is something he rarely talks about, even today. Tom came running back inside, pale as a ghost, out of breath, almost unable to speak. He said he had seen something in the backyard, near the fence. A giant creature, bigger than any animal he had ever seen. He described it as a monstrous bat, with huge wings and eyes that glowed just like the creature that had chased us on the road. But this time, it wasn't flying. It was just standing there watching. Tom had always been the curious type, the older brother who loved exploring the unknown and challenging fear in ways I never understood. But that night, his curiosity almost cost more than we could imagine. He swore with a pale face and wide eyes that he saw the creature slowly rise. At first, it seemed like a large animal, perhaps a giant bat, but the closer it got, the more Tom realized it wasn't. The creature had something humanoid about it. When it stood up, its limbs stretched in an unnatural way, as if its bones were deformed. Its skin was pale and glowed under the faint moonlight, stretched over muscles that seemed twisted and dislocated, as if its body had been shaped by evil unknown forces. The worst part was the eyes. Two red dots burning in the darkness, fixed on Tom, as if they could see right into him, sucking away his courage and leaving only the most primal fear. He said that the moment the creature's eyes locked onto his, all the air seemed to disappear from his lungs. Terror paralyzed him, but he managed to force himself to back away. The creature's huge wings opened with a sound like tearing leather, and at that moment, he knew he wasn't facing anything natural. Pure fear overtook him. He ran like never before, stumbling along the way, until he finally reached the door and locked it with such desperate force that he almost broke the handle. Inside the house, chaos ensued. I remember clearly the heavy sound of Tom's breathing, trying to explain what he had seen, his words coming out rushed and incoherent, while my mother whispered prayers, clutching a rosary as if it could ward off the evil we felt surrounding our house. My father, ever the skeptic, stood by the door with a knife in hand, as if that could be enough against something that came from a place far beyond our understanding. That night felt endless. We sat in the living room, with the lights off, all in silence. We could hear sounds coming from outside, dry snaps, as if branches were breaking, soft and irregular knocks that echoed as if something large was creeping through the yard. Occasionally, there were whispers. They weren't clear, but they were like voices dancing on the edge of hearing, incomprehensible but full of an implicit threat, as if something was calling to us, trying to lure us outside. The fear I felt that night wasn't just the fear of an unknown creature. It was something deeper, as if the entire environment was soaked in a malevolent energy, an invisible weight pressing down on our chests and paralyzing us, waiting for something worse. I knew we all knew, it wasn't just what Tom had seen out there. There was something bigger, something much older and more evil watching. And it seemed to enjoy our fear. When the sun finally began to rise, we dragged ourselves to the door, exhausted and still consumed by terror. My father was the first to step outside cautiously, his eyes scanning the yard for any sign of the creature. Outside, the morning seemed normal, almost too calm, but the evidence that something had been there didn't take long to appear. The marks on the ground. They were large, deep, and strange footprints. They looked like the tracks of something walking on two legs, but the claws were so sharp they dug into the ground like blades. They circled the entire house repeatedly, as if the creature had been watching us all night, walking in circles, just waiting. The footprints disappeared mysteriously at the edge of the forest behind our house. They seemed to end suddenly, as if the creature had simply dissolved into the air, or worse, returned to some place from which it never should have come. My father stood there, staring at the ground for a long time before shaking his head, saying nothing. From that day on, the house was never the same. My mother forbade any mention of what had happened. We weren't allowed to talk about the creature, the footprints, or what Tom had seen in the yard. It was as if simply speaking of it would give it power, call it back. But what disturbed me most was Tom's silence. In the days following the incident, he barely spoke. He seemed lost in his own thoughts, always with a distant look in his eyes, as if reliving every detail of that night. Even when he started to return to normal, he was never the same. A few weeks later, he confided something to me that he never told anyone else. He said that night, while he was running back to the house, he heard a whisper. A faint, raspy voice coming directly from the darkness, calling his name. Tom, it said, repeatedly. Tom, Tom, Tom. He looked at me with an expression of fear I will never forget. He said the voice seemed to be inside his head, and to this day, on quiet nights, he still hears it. Always the same voice calling him, as if it's waiting for him, out there in the darkness. We never found out what that creature was. We don't know if it was a vengeful spirit, a demon, or something worse, something that defies all explanations. The only thing we know is that since that night, the fear has never fully left us. Our house was marked by what we faced. Even now, so many years later, when the wind blows hard at night, I feel like something is still out there waiting. Maybe it was just playing with us that night. Maybe it was testing our limits. And if it ever decides to come back, well, I don't know what we'll do. All I know is that there are things in this world that we should never try to understand, things that shouldn't be seen. And that night, we faced one of them. To this day, Tom won't speak about what he truly saw in that creature when it stood before him. Maybe it's better that way. Maybe what he saw in that darkness is a secret that should remain buried, an unsolvable mystery. Because sometimes, the worst part of a nightmare isn't what you see, but what you feel, and we all felt something that night that has never left us. Clarice falls silent, her eyes still fixed on the past, trapped in that unsolvable mystery, wrapped in the shadows of something that should never have existed. Story 4. It was Halloween night in 2023, in the quiet little town of Ashton Creek, deep in the United States. Ashton Creek was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and Halloween nights were filled with kids running through the streets, dressed up and hunting for candy. But that night, something different hung in the air. The cold wind whispered through the trees, and dry leaves danced on the ground, as if being guided by an invisible force. In the corner house on Maple Street, two friends, Lena and Harper, were getting ready to spend the rest of the night alone. After accompanying their younger siblings through the streets, collecting candy and having fun, they had returned to Lena's house. Lena's parents were out of town, and her siblings were already asleep. The house was quiet. They took the chance to stay up late, watch horror movies, and talk about the usual things teenagers discuss on Halloween nights. However, there was a tension in the air, something Harper had felt ever since they got back. Harper had always been different. Ever since she was little, she knew something surrounded her, something she couldn't explain but had always been present in her life. When she was 7, she had her first vision, and it was terrifying. She saw her grandfather, pale and lifeless, lying in a bed, surrounded by doctors. The problem was, her grandfather was perfectly fine when she had that vision. But 2 days later, he died suddenly, exactly as she had seen. Since then, Harper began to see things no one else could see, to feel presences no one else could sense. It was as if the world around her was always in motion, full of shadows and whispers that she couldn't ignore. In the days leading up to Halloween, Harper's dreams became more vivid. She saw figures moving through the streets of Ashton Creek at night, distorted faces staring at her through windows, and one presence in particular that seemed to follow her. She didn't know what it all meant, but the feeling of being watched was becoming more and more real. Something was wrong, and she knew it. Back that night, Lena had chosen the scariest movie she could find, a classic ghost story, and the two settled on the living room couch, wrapped in blankets with dim lighting around them. But Harper could hardly pay attention. Her eyes kept being drawn to the window next to the room. The street was empty, but the darkness beyond the glass seemed thicker, as if it was moving. She felt a chill run down her spine, and for a moment, she thought she saw a figure quickly pass on the other side of the glass. "Did you see that?" she asked, turning to Lena. "See what?" Lena laughed, not picking up on the serious tone in her friend's voice. Harper stood up and walked to the window, pressing her face against the cold glass. She looked out at the empty street, but there was nothing there. Still, the feeling that something was out there wouldn't leave her. Suddenly, a loud banging sound came from the front door, echoing through the house. Both girls froze. They knew it wasn't a prank. Ashton Creek was quiet at this time of night, and no one usually knocked this late. "It's probably just the wind," Lena muttered, trying to convince herself, but the expression on Harper's face said otherwise. The heavy feeling in the air, which had started as soon as they returned home, was now almost unbearable. Harper could feel it. It was as if the house itself was reacting to the presence of something that didn't belong. "Let's go to my room," Lena suggested, trying to mask her growing fear. Harper nodded, and both quickly went upstairs, locking the door behind them as soon as they entered the room. For a moment, the atmosphere felt safer, but Harper couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them. The wind outside was beginning to blow harder, and the windows in the room began to tremble lightly. Harper walked over to the bedroom window, driven by a morbid curiosity. Outside, the street was still deserted, but there was something, a shadow maybe? Something moving between the trees in the back of the yard. She tried to focus, but the shadow quickly vanished. "Harper, you're scaring me," Lena said, staring at her friend. That's when the first sound came. A light scratching at the bedroom door. It wasn't a knock but a continuous sound, like nails dragging across the wood. Lena jumped up suddenly, her heart racing. "Harper, you locked the door, right?" Harper nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the door. The scratching continued, growing more intense with each passing second. Then, the door handle started to turn. First slowly, then faster, as if someone was desperate to get in. Both girls stood frozen, their hearts beating so loudly they could barely breathe. The handle kept twisting frantically, as if something on the other side was trying to force its way in. Lena moved closer to Harper, fear written all over her face. What is that? Is someone out there? Harper closed her eyes, trying to block out the sounds, but the feeling of dread was unbearable. Something was there, something that wanted to get in. And deep down, she knew it wasn't human. The visions she had had over the past few weeks, the faceless figures, the shadows lurking, it was all connected. Everything had led to this moment. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence was so thick that they could hardly breathe. Lena took a step toward the door, but Harper grabbed her arm. "Don't open it," she said, her voice low and tense. Before they could process what was happening, the glass in the bedroom window cracked, as if something had pressed against it. Harper quickly turned around, and that's when she saw it. A figure was outside, floating in the darkness. It was tall, much taller than any normal person, and it had a pale, empty face, with no eyes, no mouth. Just a vacant presence that seemed to consume the light around it. Harper froze. Whatever that thing was, she knew it wasn't from this world. It was a manifestation of something that had been haunting her, maybe since the moment she had her first vision as a child. And now it was here lurking, waiting for her. Lena, still not fully understanding what was happening, looked at Harper and then at the window. What are you seeing?" But Harper couldn't speak. The creature outside was moving closer, pressing itself against the glass as if it wanted to break through. The whispers Harper had been hearing in her dreams started echoing in her mind, like distant voices calling her name, urging her to open the window and let it in. That's when the window shattered with a deafening crash. Shards of glass flew across the room, and Lena screamed, grabbing onto Harper. The creature was gone, but the heaviness in the air remained. Something had entered the room. Something invisible, but present. The two girls ran out of the room, rushing downstairs and locking themselves in the living room. They held each other, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The lights in the house began flickering, and the sound of whispers filled the air, coming from all around them. To this day, Harper and Lena have never spoken about what happened that Halloween night. No one would believe them anyway. But Harper knows it wasn't just a coincidence. The presence that had been following her all her life, the thing she had always felt around her, had finally revealed itself. And the scariest part is, she knows it's still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back. And since that night, she's never looked out the window again. Story 5. My name is Friedrich, and the story I'm about to tell you is one that deeply marked my life. I am not an ordinary person. From a young age, I've been drawn to the mysteries of the occult, to the secrets that the world around us seems to hide. I grew up in a small town in Germany, surrounded by superstitions and ancient stories, but it was when I moved to the United States that my life took a truly dark turn. By that time, I was already involved in the practices of traditional witchcraft, an ancestral knowledge passed down through generations. There was a group of us who met periodically to perform powerful rituals, connecting ourselves to the energies that permeate the world. Our belief was that on certain nights of the year, the veil between the worlds became thinner, allowing entities from other realms to manifest. Halloween was one of those nights when fear and mystery intertwine, and incomprehensible things can happen. The first experience I had took place at Cannon Beach, a place known for its beauty but also for the secrets it hides in the shadows of the night. It was Halloween, and our group, made up of 7 practitioners, decided to perform a ritual by the sea. We knew that the energies of that night would be powerful, and we were eager to connect with whatever was lurking in the depths of the ocean and the darkness of the night. The beach was deserted when we arrived, except for the constant sound of waves crashing on the sand. The sky was overcast, and a thick mist began to form, making the atmosphere even denser and more mysterious. We lit our candles around a circle drawn in the sand and began to chant ancient hymns, invoking the spirits of the earth and the water. The wind blew strong, and every word seemed to be carried beyond the ocean. As the ritual progressed, something strange began to happen. The waves began to glow with a bluish light, as if some mysterious force was manifesting in the depths of the sea. At first, We thought it was just the common bioluminescence seen on some beaches, but soon we realized it was different. The lights began to move, clustering into distinct shapes. They floated above the waves, drawing closer to us. I will never forget the feeling I had when these lights finally got close enough for us to see clearly. They weren't just glowing lights in the water. They had form. They were small humanoid figures with translucent wings, fluttering lightly as if they were dancing on the waves. Fairies, someone whispered. It was the only explanation. But these creatures didn't resemble the fairies from children's stories. There was something about them, something ancient and sinister, as if they were not just part of nature, but guardians of something much larger and more dangerous. The fairies drew even closer, and we felt an intense cold surround the circle, despite being in front of the sea. Our candles began to flicker, threatening to go out. And then, a soft but clear voice whispered in our ears, coming from all directions, "You shouldn't be here." That was enough to paralyze us. The ritual was interrupted, and we all stood still, watching the lights that were now circling around our circle. For a moment, time seemed to stop. And suddenly, as quickly as they had appeared, the figures disappeared, swallowed by the sea. The beach returned to being just a beach, but the air felt different, charged with something we couldn't explain. No one said a word on the way back, but we all knew we had witnessed something that didn't belong to our world. The second experience was even more terrifying. 2 years later, we decided to do something more daring. This time, our destination was the Catskill Mountains, a remote place surrounded by dense forests and known for its mystical energy. Once again, it was Halloween, and we gathered in the heart of the forest, far from any trace of civilization, to perform a ritual of connection with the spirits of the earth. The campsite we set up was located in a clearing, surrounded by trees so tall you could barely see the sky. The place was isolated, and the feeling of being in the middle of something ancient and unexplored was palpable. Our goal was to open a portal, an invitation to the spirits to manifest and show us what the invisible world held. Everything started as planned. We lit the fires, drew ancient symbols on the ground, and the ritual chant echoed through the trees. The moon, partially covered by clouds, illuminated the clearing with a weak, unsettling light. Time seemed to slow as we connected with the mountain's energies. That's when we felt it. At first, it was just footsteps. Slow, heavy, breaking dry branches under invisible feet. They echoed through the forest around us, coming from all directions. We stopped chanting, trying to listen more closely. The footsteps continued, growing closer, but we couldn't see anything beyond the darkness between the trees. The wind began to blow harder, as if the mountain itself was whispering to us, warning that something was approaching. One of the group members, Elsa, who was sensitive to spiritual presences, whispered that something was watching us. Something that wasn't human. We decided to end the ritual, but it was too late. The atmosphere around us had changed. The air grew denser, heavier, as if it was filled with malevolent energy. And then we saw them. The shadows emerged slowly from the deep darkness of the forest, as if they were part of the night itself. But there was something wrong, something that made our hearts race and our bodies freeze with terror. They didn't move like normal beings. Their steps were disjointed, their bodies undulated as if they were trapped in some kind of nightmare, struggling to fully manifest. The air around us grew so heavy that each breath required a desperate effort, as if the very oxygen was being sucked away by the presence of those entities. The fires, which had been burning brightly, began to flicker, trembling as if they feared what was approaching. The light from the flames wavered, casting even more sinister shadows around us, distorting the figures now surrounding us, their indistinct forms blending with the darkness as if they were part of it. What had been a cold but bearable night had transformed into something else entirely. The temperature dropped drastically, a chill that penetrated to the bone, a cold that didn't come from the air but from the sense that something terrible, something ancient and hungry, was watching us. I tried to scream, but my voice died in my throat. The fear was palpable, a separate entity pressing against my chest and making every heartbeat torment. We knew we had done something terribly wrong, something that had broken the rules between the worlds, and now the shadows were coming to correct that mistake. Their eyes, two glowing red points in the darkness, fixed on us, unblinking, unyielding, seemed to pierce our souls. They were the eyes of something that had existed far longer than we had, something that understood fear in a way we could never comprehend. We tried to run. An instinctual urge made us try to break the circle we had created, but it was as if something invisible was holding us, an unseen force keeping us trapped, like marionettes in a nightmare that was still unfolding. The closer the shadows came, the more the air around us vibrated with dark energy. The whispers began, low, almost inaudible at first, but they quickly intensified. They came from all sides, like a chorus of voices echoing through the trees. We couldn't understand the words, but the malice in them was clear. They were cursing us, marking us in a way that we could never erase. Panic took hold completely. We tried to chant words of protection, incantations we knew well, but our voices sounded fragile and insignificant in the face of the overwhelming presence that now surrounded us. Every word seemed to be swallowed by the icy wind, turned into an empty echo. The shadows, indifferent to our desperation, continued to approach, their erratic and grotesque movements playing with our sanity. There was something profoundly wrong with their forms, as if they were bodies shaped by something that didn't understand the concept of humanity. Then Elsa screamed. A sharp sound, filled with pure terror. We followed her gaze, and that's when we saw it. There, at the top of the mountain, a gigantic figure stood among the trees. It wasn't like the shadows surrounding us. This creature was towering, made of condensed darkness, and its eyes glowed with an intense light, like burning embers. It was as if all the power permeating the place emanated from it, as if it were the guardian of that profane territory. Its presence was suffocating, and even from a distance, it was impossible not to feel the weight of its attention. It was as if the mountain itself had come alive, manifested in that terrible form, watching us with a dark, cold curiosity. I felt small, insignificant, as if I was standing before something that should not be witnessed by human eyes. The creature didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, pressing against our minds and bodies as if it was suffocating us with its mere existence. The fear, which had once been just a feeling, was now a physical entity, almost tangible, squeezing our hearts and whispering in our minds that there was no escape. Desperate, someone in the group remembered one last attempt at protection. Salt. One of the members quickly grabbed the salt and scattered it around the circle, creating a barrier we knew could repel evil spirits. For a brief moment, the shadows hesitated. The whispers quieted, and the air was heavy with agonizing expectation. Time seemed to stop. We looked to the figure at the top of the mountain, waiting for it to make a move, to give us some sign that we were either safe or doomed. Then, as if it had all been just a dream, the creature disappeared. It evaporated into the darkness, as if it had never existed. The shadows around us began to dissipate like smoke carried away by the wind, and silence returned to the clearing. The cold still lingered, but something had changed. The suffocating presence was gone. We left the camp that night without looking back. Each of us knew we had crossed a line, witnessed something that wasn't meant to be seen. The creature, the shadows, the whispers, were proof that there are forces in the world that don't belong to this realm, and that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Since that night, we have never returned to that mountain, and we never speak of what happened. But the mystery remains, haunting our dreams, echoing in our minds. We know that something saw us, something ancient and hungry, and that in some way it is still watching us. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear footsteps. They come from far away, from the depths of the forest, and each sound is a reminder that there are things in this world we cannot understand, things we cannot control. And the worst part is, I know those footsteps, those whispers in the wind, aren't just memories. They are a warning. And one day, I fear they will come to claim what is rightfully theirs. Story 6. My name is Kate, and what I'm about to tell you still haunts me, even many years later. It was on a Halloween night, and I was 17 years old. I lived in a small town in rural America called Raven Hollow, a place with its own legends and superstitions. Everyone knew the stories, and of course, no one took them too seriously, except on nights like that one, when the air felt heavier, as if the darkness hid more than just the absence of light. It was late at night, around 11 o'clock. I was heading to my friend Emily's house, where we were going to spend the night watching horror movies, just a typical evening. To get there, there was a shortcut that passed through the town cemetery, an old neglected place with moss-covered gravestones and twisted trees that looked like hands rising from the earth. I had always been reluctant to go through there, but that night, with a cold wind cutting through the air and the shadows stretching in strange ways, the idea of shortening the walk didn't seem so bad. The cemetery was enveloped in an almost solid darkness, and the sound of the wind whispering through the trees made me uneasy. As I walked along one of the paths that cut between the gravestones, I started to feel something strange. It wasn't just the cold, but the feeling that something was watching me. The air around me felt heavier, and each of my steps echoed in a way that it shouldn't. There was a terrifying silence, as if the world had paused to watch what was about to happen. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the other side of the cemetery, near an old worn gravestone. A woman tall and thin, dressed in a dirty faded wedding dress that looked more like the ghost of a past era than a real person. The dress, once white, was now yellowed with age, and the veil, which partially covered her face, swayed lightly in the wind. Her arms were stretched out to her sides, motionless, as if she were waiting for someone. But the most disturbing thing was her face, or what I could see of it. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, they were empty, without sparkle, without life. I knew the legend. Everyone in Raven Hollow did. They said that many years ago, a young bride had been left at the altar by the man who had promised to love her. Devastated, she threw herself from a nearby cliff, and since then, on Halloween nights, her spirit wanders the cemetery, searching for her groom, waiting for him to return to her. They say that anyone who sees her will disappear soon after, taken by the eternal sadness that accompanies her. I didn't believe in those stories, until that moment. My legs froze, and my heart was beating so fast it felt like it might burst from my chest. The bride didn't move, but I could feel her eyes, those empty hollows, fixed on me. Fear took over me, and as much as I wanted to run, my feet felt glued to the ground. Suddenly, a cold breeze passed by me, and I heard a voice, soft and low, but clear enough to make me tremble. "You shouldn't be here." I turned suddenly, and there she was, a blonde girl with long loose hair and large curious eyes. She looked about 10 years old, dressed in a simple dress, but her face was serene, almost ethereal. "Come," she said, reaching out her hand to me. "I'll take you somewhere safe." Without thinking twice, I reached out and touched her hand. Her touch was cold, but in a strange way it was comforting, as if her temperature was in tune with the mystery of the night. It was a coldness that didn't scare but brought an almost supernatural calm. Her thin, delicate fingers wrapped around mine, and at that moment, I sensed there was something more to this girl, something I couldn't quite understand. She pulled me gently, without haste but with a firmness that made me trust her immediately. We began walking toward the cemetery exit, and with each step, my heart continued racing. I knew I shouldn't, but my body almost begged to look back, to see if the bride was still there. I could feel her empty gaze burning on the back of my neck, as if she were disappointed, as if she had expected me to go to her. The sensation that she was following me was almost unbearable, as if at any moment, I would feel a cold hand touch my shoulder. But I didn't look back. As the girl guided me, something around us began to change. At first it was subtle. The wind, which had been howling through the trees, stopped completely, as if the air itself was trapped, confined, surrounding us. The world around us seemed to lose all life. There were no more sounds of leaves, no rustling wind, or even the echo of our footsteps on the gravel path of the cemetery. The silence was total, oppressive. It was as if we were inside a bubble, cut off from any reality. I glanced up at the sky for a moment and noticed that even the clouds had stopped moving. They were suspended in the air, motionless, like a painting framed by the night's darkness. The intense cold that had surrounded me at the beginning of the walk was also fading, replaced by a strange sense of neutrality. It wasn't hot, nor cold. It was as if time itself had stopped. Each step we took seemed distorted, as if the path had grown longer than usual. The girl, who had said nothing until then, led me in silence, but I could feel a presence, something invisible walking beside us, lurking. It was as if we were being followed, but I didn't dare look to the sides or behind me. Fear mixed with confusion, and my mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. Finally, when we reached Emily's street, the girl let go of my hand. The cold touch vanished suddenly, as if the bond she had created between us had been severed the moment we left the cemetery's boundaries. She turned to me with a light smile, as if everything had been completely normal, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But her eyes, there was something in her eyes. Something I couldn't decipher, a depth that was both familiar and unsettling. "Now you are safe," she said, her voice so soft it was almost carried away by the air. Still gasping for breath, with my heart racing and my mind in tatters, I managed to stammer, "Thank you, but who are you?" She didn't answer. The silence after my question was heavy, almost deafening. Instead of replying, she took a step back, her eyes still locked on mine, as if she wanted to say something without using words. The street around us was completely empty. No lights on in the houses, no sound of passing cars, no wind rustling the trees. It was as if the entire world had been emptied. I turned for a second to look around, trying to understand where we were, how we had arrived so quickly, and why everything felt so surreal. When I looked back at the girl, she was no longer there. She had disappeared as swiftly as she had appeared. There was no trace of her anywhere. No footsteps, no echo, no shadows. It was as if she had never existed. I stood there in the middle of the street, feeling a mixture of confusion and rising terror. The air around me seemed to compress, making each breath harder to take. My hands were ice cold, and my whole body trembled, but it wasn't just from the cold. It was fear. Fear that something much bigger than I could understand had happened that night. When I finally reached Emily's house, I told her everything, desperate for some explanation. At first she laughed, thinking it was a joke or that I was just spooked by the night's atmosphere. But when she saw the seriousness on my face, her smile faded, and she went silent. "Kate, it must have been your imagination," she said, trying to calm me down. "Maybe fear made you see things." But it wasn't just that. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. The bride, with her empty eyes and dirty dress, was real. She was there. And the blonde girl, whoever she was, there was something far beyond normal about her. A presence that didn't belong to this world, something that brought me peace but also carried a dark mystery. For a long time, I tried to forget that night. I avoided going near the cemetery, avoided talking about what had happened. But the mystery of that night never truly left me. Who was the bride? Why did I see her? And why did the girl appear to save me, only to disappear without a trace? There were nights afterward when I would dream of the blonde girl. She always appeared the same way, calm, serene, but at the same time distant, unreachable. In my dreams, I would try to talk to her, ask why she had helped me, but I never got any answers. Just silence. To this day, I wonder if the girl was truly my guardian angel, as my grandmother used to believe, or if there was something more, something much darker, behind that encounter. I feel like I will never have all the answers, but one thing I know, that night, something very old and very dangerous watched me, and whatever it was, it's still out there lurking, waiting. And sometimes, when the wind blows hard and the night is darker than usual, I feel the same weight in the air, the same cold. As if the bride's eyes are still following me, still waiting. My name is Caleb, and what I am about to tell you happened in August 2010. It's a story I've never been able to forget, one that still makes me question the fine line between reality and the supernatural. At that time, I was just an ordinary kid with ordinary friends and dreams without great ambitions. Everything was normal until Halloween that year, when things started to unravel in a way no one, not even I, could have predicted. It all began with the naive idea of organizing a Halloween party at school. It was August, and although we were still far from the official date, we decided to have the party early, as a kind of rehearsal for the real Halloween. My classroom was chosen to be the haunted tunnel, and 8 of my friends and I spent days decorating the space with everything we could find. Fake spiderwebs, hanging skeletons, dim lights to create that dark, suffocating atmosphere. On the eve of the party, I was tasked with finalizing the last details on my own. The principal trusted me, so she gave me the key to lock the classroom once everything was ready. Sometimes, I wonder if that decision was the start of something much darker. I was alone at the school, and the feeling of being in such a big, empty building started to bother me. Deep down, I've always been afraid of places like that. Long, deserted hallways, dark rooms where the echo of your footsteps seems to follow you. While finishing the decorations, something on the chalkboard caught my eye. There was a message written in large, crooked letters that I didn't remember putting there: "Don't come." I froze for a moment, trying to figure out how that had appeared. I knew I was alone. There was no one else in the school at that hour. I approached the chalkboard, trying to find a logical explanation, but the more I stared at those words, the stronger the feeling that something was wrong. But like any young person who thinks they're invincible, I ignored the warning. I erased the chalkboard, locked the classroom, and went home, convincing myself it must have been a prank by one of my friends. That night, something strange happened. I had a dream, no, a nightmare, that haunts me to this day. I was in a dark place, surrounded by distorted figures. They laughed at me, mocking me, but their faces, they were impossible to describe, as if they were melting, constantly shifting shape. The darkness around me felt alive, almost suffocating. The laughter echoed from all directions, and I felt a growing pressure in my chest, as if something was crushing me. When I tried to scream, no sound came out, as if the darkness had stolen my voice. Then suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was a tall man, cloaked in black, with a cape that dragged on the ground. His face was hidden by a hood, and all I could see were 2 glowing points where his eyes should have been. He didn't say a word, but somehow, I knew he was there for me. His mere gaze instilled in me a fear so deep that I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The clock read 3 a.m. I tried to forget the nightmare, but something about it felt so real that it left me unsettled for the rest of the day. At school, I did my best not to think about it. It was party day, and I had to focus on having fun with my friends and the other students. But deep down, the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. When night came, the haunted tunnel was packed. I was excited, enjoying scaring the people who entered. But as the night went on, I started noticing something strange, a presence. Something or someone was watching me, even when no one else was in the hallway. I saw shadows moving along the walls, but when I turned around, there was nothing. The fun atmosphere began to feel increasingly oppressive. And then he appeared. In the middle of one of the scares, something happened that I will never forget. The tunnel was dark, illuminated only by a few flickering lights that cast long shadows on the walls. The sound of laughter and screams filled the air, but suddenly, everything around me seemed to stop. It was as if time had slowed down. That's when I saw him. At the end of the tunnel, between the shadows, a man in a black cloak stood completely still, watching me. His face was hidden beneath a hood, and his presence made the entire space feel suffocating. I knew the instant I saw him that he wasn't part of the act. That wasn't a costume designed to scare people. This was something far worse. My entire body froze. Panic overtook me, and it felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to move or look away. The silence was almost deafening, and somehow, I could feel the weight of his invisible eyes fixed on me, piercing my soul. Every second he stood there, staring, felt like an eternity. Then, he started to move. Slowly. His steps were almost imperceptible, as if he were gliding across the floor. I couldn't hear anything, but I felt the ground vibrate beneath my feet, as if his mere presence was displacing the air around us. With each step he took toward me, the pressure in my chest grew heavier. It felt as though the air was becoming denser, harder to breathe. As he got closer, I finally glimpsed part of his face beneath the hood. 2 points of light, his eyes, glowed with a fiery red intensity, locked on me. That look wasn't human. It was empty, cold, as if he had no soul. And when he was close enough, I smelled something rotten in the air, like decaying flesh. He stopped just inches from me, and his presence was so overwhelming that I could barely stand. "Why didn't you listen?" His voice was a hoarse whisper, but every word seemed to reverberate inside my head, filling my ears like distant thunder. "I warned you. Now I will kill you." Before I could react, everything went dark. The last thing I felt was the cold ground beneath me as I fell into a void of darkness. When I woke up, I was lying on a stretcher, surrounded by worried faces. The principal, my parents, everyone was staring at me with a mix of relief and confusion. They said I had fainted from fright, but something inside me screamed that it was much more than that. I had seen something no one else had. Something beyond this world. That night, terrified by what had happened, my parents took me to a spiritual center. I had always been skeptical about these things, but the situation had spiraled out of control. The medium who attended to us seemed to know more than he was willing to reveal. As soon as I walked in, he looked at me with a heavy expression, as if he already knew what I was carrying with me. "You've been marked," he said in a low, grave tone, making the air around me feel heavier. "That figure. He won't stop chasing you until you do what he wants." I was confused. What did he want from me? Why me? The medium performed a spiritual cleansing session, chanting words I couldn't understand as he tried to protect me from the entity. But at the end of the session, he looked at me with a somber expression and said something I will never forget: "He's still there. But for now, you're protected." In the days that followed, the presence of the man in the black cloak became a constant in my life. I would see him in the distance, always watching from afar, like a lurking shadow. He never came closer, but I knew he was waiting for the right moment. Each time I saw him, my body froze, and a deep terror overtook me. Then the tragedy happened. A few months later, on a quiet night, my little sister Sarah disappeared. She had been playing in the backyard, as she did every night, when my mom called her in for dinner. But this time, Sarah didn't respond. When my mom went outside to look for her, all she found was the empty swing, gently swaying in the cold night breeze. We searched everywhere. The police were called, searches were conducted, but Sarah had vanished without a trace. No sounds, no signs. Just the agonizing silence of that night, broken by my parents' desperation. What haunts me to this day is what I saw just before Sarah disappeared. That night, as I was in my room, I looked out the window and saw the figure in the black cloak standing beside the tree in the backyard, watching my sister play. He was there, still as ever. I tried to scream, I tried to run to her, but it was as if something held me in place. My body was frozen, my feet glued to the ground, unable to do anything to help. And then he vanished. Just like Sarah. Since that night, the presence of the man in the black cloak has never left me. Sometimes I feel his gaze in the shadows, in the corners of the places I go, as if he's always watching, waiting, planning. I know he won't stop. He already took away what I loved most once, and now I know he's just waiting for the right moment to return. The question that haunts me is, why did he choose me? What does he want from me? And the worst part, what will he do when he comes back? And maybe I'll never have an answer. The days after Sarah's disappearance were a blur of despair and anguish. My mother barely spoke, and my father, always so rational and practical, now seemed like an empty shell. The police continued their searches for weeks, but there were no clues, no signs of where she might be. Deep down, we all knew Sarah wasn't coming back. Something had taken her away from us. Something that somehow I was involved with. The nights became worse. Every time silence fell, the weight of what had happened crushed me. I tried to sleep, but I always woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that something was watching me. I knew he was there, the man in the black cloak. Even when I couldn't see him, I could feel his presence, like a cold, malevolent shadow hovering around me. It was about a month after the tragedy when things escalated. That night, I woke up again at 3 a.m., just like that first time. I was sweating, and my room felt even darker and heavier than usual. The air was thick, and there was a musty smell, as if something old and rotten was in the room with me. I sat up in bed, trying to calm the panic rising inside me. Then I heard it. A scratching noise, coming from the window. Slow, deliberate, like something was scraping against the glass on purpose to get my attention. A chill ran down my spine. For a moment, I thought about getting up and running, but something inside me knew that this time, there was nowhere to run. With my heart racing, I slowly turned my head toward the window. And there he was. The man in the black cloak, outside, watching me. His eyes, two glowing red dots in the darkness, pierced through me with a terrifying intensity. He didn't move, but I knew he was smiling. I could feel the contempt and malice emanating from him, like a thick, suffocating fog. "You can't escape, Caleb," he whispered, his voice echoing inside my head like a distant storm that reverberated through every part of me. "I warned you, and now it's too late." That's when I realized. He wasn't just there for me. He had already taken Sarah, and now he was coming back to finish what he started. The terror I felt in that moment is indescribable. My entire body shook, my muscles were locked in fear, and for a second, I thought I would pass out again. But this time, something inside me refused to give in. I remembered the spiritual center, the words the medium had spoken, and how he said that for now I was protected. Clinging to that small spark of hope, I closed my eyes and started murmuring the words the medium had taught me. They were words of protection, ancient prayers meant to ward off evil. I didn't know if they would work, but they were all I had. As I kept repeating the words, I felt the atmosphere around me change. The air became lighter, and the sound of the scratching began to fade. I opened my eyes, still whispering the prayer, and saw that the man in the black cloak had stepped back. His eyes still glowed, but now there was something different in them, a contained rage. He was being pushed back. "You think this will save you?" he whispered mockingly. "Do you think your words can stop me? I'm not done. Not yet." And with that, he vanished into the darkness, as if he had never been there. That night was a brief reprieve, but I knew he would be back. The medium had been right. I was marked, and nothing I did could change that. He wanted something from me, something I still didn't fully understand. The following days were chaotic. I started investigating, trying to find answers about who or what the man in the black cloak could be. But every lead I followed ended in a dead end. I was becoming more and more obsessed, trying to figure out why he had chosen me and what he really wanted. Then, the final tragedy struck. One night, while I was still awake, studying some old spiritual texts I had found at a library, I heard a noise coming from the living room. A dull thud, like something had fallen to the floor. I rushed to see what it was, and there I found my parents. They were lying on the floor, motionless, as if they had simply collapsed. Desperate, I tried to wake them, but it was no use. It was as if their lives had been drained from their bodies, leaving nothing but emptiness. My screams echoed through the house, but there was no response. They were gone, just like Sarah. And then, I saw him again. The man in the black cloak was there, standing in the doorway, his hood pulled low over his face. But this time, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him, holding his hand, was Sarah, my sister, with the same empty, pale look she had when she disappeared. "I warned you, Caleb," he said calmly. "I always finish what I start." Before I could react, he and Sarah disappeared, leaving me alone in the deathly silence of the house. Since that night, I know I'm lost. Nothing can protect me from what's coming. The man in the black cloak took everything from me, and now, he's just waiting for the right moment to finish what he began. But the worst part is, I don't know how he's going to do it. And maybe, when he finally comes for me, I'll never have the chance to find out. The mystery of what he really wants remains, but the only certainty I have is that, in the end, he always wins. And so, I wait. In the middle of one of the games, something happened that I will never forget. The tunnel was dark, lit only by a few dim, flickering lights that cast long shadows on the walls. The sound of laughter and screams filled the air as everyone enjoyed the fun, but suddenly, everything around me seemed to stop. It was as if time had slowed down. That's when I saw him. At the end of the tunnel, standing between the shadows, was a man in a black cloak, completely still watching me. His face was hidden beneath the hood, and his presence made the entire atmosphere feel suffocating. The moment I saw him, I knew he wasn't part of the game. This wasn't just a costume meant to scare people. This was something much worse. My volle body frotze. Panic overtook me, and it was like being trapped in a nightmare, unable to move or look away. The silence was almost deafening, and somehow, I could feel the weight of his invisible eyes fixed on me, piercing my soul. Every second he stood there, watching, felt like an eternity. Then, he started moving. Slowly. His steps were barely perceptible, as if he was gliding across the floor. I couldn't hear anything, but I felt the ground vibrating beneath my feet, as if his very presence was displacing the air around him. Every step he took toward me made the pressure in my chest grow. It was like the air was becoming heavier, harder to breathe. As he got closer, I finally caught a glimpse of his face beneath the hood. Two glowing points of light, his eyes, burned with a fiery red glow, locked onto me. That gaze wasn't human. It was empty, cold, as if he had no soul. And when he got close enough, I smelled something rotten in the air, like decaying flesh. He stopped just inches from me, and his presence was so overwhelming that I could barely stand. "Why didn't you obey me?" His voice was a raspy whisper, but each word seemed to reverberate inside my head, filling my ears like distant thunder. "I warned you. Now I'm going to kill you." Before I could react, everything went dark. The last thing I felt was the cold floor against my body as I fell into a pit of darkness. When I woke up, I was on a stretcher, surrounded by worried faces. The principal, my parents, they were all watching me with a mix of relief and confusion. They told me I had fainted from fright, but something inside me screamed that it was much more than that. I had seen something no one else had. Something that was beyond this world. That night, terrified by what had happened, my parents took me to a spiritual center. I had always been skeptical about those things, but the situation was out of control. The medium who received us seemed to know more than he was willing to share. As soon as I walked in, he looked at me with a heavy expression, as if he already knew what I was carrying with me. "You've been marked," he said in a low, grave tone, making the air around me feel heavier. "That figure. He won't stop chasing you until you do what he wants." I was confused. What did he want from me? Why me? The medium performed a spiritual cleansing, chanting words I didn't understand, trying to protect me from the entity. But at the end of the session, he looked at me with a somber expression and said something I will never forget: "He's still there. But for now, you're protected." In the days that followed, the presence of the man in the black cloak became a constant in my life. I saw him from a distance, always watching, lurking like a shadow. He never got close, but I knew he was waiting for the right moment. Every time I saw him, my body froze, and a deep terror consumed me. Then the tragedy happened. A few months later, on a quiet night, my younger sister Sarah disappeared. She had been playing in the backyard, as she did every evening, when my mom called her in for dinner. But this time, Sarah didn't answer. When my mom went outside to look for her, all she found was the empty swing, gently swaying in the cold night breeze. We searched everywhere. The police were called, searches were conducted, but Sarah was gone without a trace. No sounds, no signs. Just the agonizing silence of that night, broken by my parents' despair. What haunts me to this day is what I saw just before Sarah disappeared. That night, while I was in my room, I looked out the window and saw the man in the black cloak standing by the tree in the backyard, watching my sister play. He was there, motionless as always. I tried to scream, tried to run to her, but it was as if something held me in place. My body was frozen, my feet glued to the floor, unable to do anything to help. And then, he disappeared. Just like Sarah. Since that night, the presence of the man in the black cloak has never left me. Sometimes, I feel his gaze in the shadows, in the corners of places I go, like he's always watching, waiting, planning. I know he won't stop. He already took away what I loved most, and now, I know he's just waiting for the right moment to return. The question that haunts me is, why did he choose me? What does he want from me? And the worst part, what will he do when he comes back? And maybe, I'll never have an answer. The days after Sarah's disappearance were a blur of despair and anguish. My mom barely spoke anymore, and my dad, always so rational and practical, now seemed like an empty shell. The police continued their searches for weeks, but there were no clues, no signs of where she could be. Deep down, we all knew Sarah wasn't coming back. Something had taken her away from us. Something that somehow I was involved in. The nights became worse. Every time silence fell, the weight of what had happened crushed me. I tried to sleep, but inevitably, I woke up in the middle of the night with a feeling that something was watching me. I knew he was there. The man in the black cloak. Even when I couldn't see him, I could feel his presence, like a cold, malevolent shadow hovering around me. It was about a month after the tragedy that things escalated. That night, I woke again at 3 a.m., just like that first time. I was drenched in sweat, and my room felt enveloped in an even darker, heavier darkness than usual. The air was thick, and there was a musty smell, as if something old and decayed was in the room with me. The air was heavier than usual, and there was a musty smell, as if something old and rotten was there with me. I sat up in bed, trying to control the panic taking over. Then I heard it, a scratching sound coming from the window. Slow, deliberate, like something was clawing at the glass on purpose to get my attention. A chill ran down my spine. For a moment, I thought about getting up and running, but something inside me knew that this time, there was nowhere to go. With my heart racing, I slowly turned my head toward the window. And there he was. The man in the black cloak, standing outside, watching me. His eyes, two glowing red points in the darkness, bored into me with terrifying intensity. He didn't move, but I knew he was smiling. I could feel the disdain and malice radiating from him, like a thick fog. "You can't escape, Caleb," he whispered, his voice echoing inside my head like a distant storm, reverberating in every corner of my being. "I warned you, and now it's too late." That's when I realized. He wasn't just there for me. He had already taken Sarah, and now he was coming back to finish what he'd started. The terror I felt at that moment was indescribable. My entire body trembled, my muscles locked with fear, and for a second, I thought I was going to faint again. But this time, something inside me refused to give in. I remembered the spiritual center, the words of the medium, and how he'd said that for now I was protected. Clinging to that small spark of hope, I closed my eyes and began murmuring the words the medium had taught me. They were words of protection, ancient prayers meant to ward off evil. I didn't know if they would work, but they were all I had. As I repeated those words, I felt the atmosphere around me shift. The air became lighter, and the sound of the scratching began to fade. I opened my eyes, still whispering the prayer, and saw that the man in the black cloak had taken a step back. His eyes still glowed, but now there was something different in them, contained anger. He was being repelled. "Do you think that will save you?" he whispered with a mocking tone. "You think your words can stop me? I'm not finished. Not yet." And with those words, he vanished into the darkness, as if he had never been there. That night brought temporary relief, but I knew he would be back. The medium was right, I had been marked, and nothing I did could change that. He wanted something from me, something I still didn't fully understand. When I woke up, I was on a stretcher, surrounded by worried faces. The principal, my parents, they were all watching me with a mix of relief and confusion. They told me I had fainted from fright, but something inside me screamed that it was much more than that. I had seen something no one else had. Something that was beyond this world. That night, terrified by what had happened, my parents took me to a spiritual center. I had always been skeptical about those things, but the situation was out of control. The medium who received us seemed to know more than he was willing to share. As soon as I walked in, he looked at me with a heavy expression, as if he already knew what I was carrying with me. "You've been marked," he said in a low, grave tone, making the air around me feel heavier. "That figure. He won't stop chasing you until you do what he wants." I was confused. What did he want from me? Why me? The medium performed a spiritual cleansing, chanting words I didn't understand, trying to protect me from the entity. But at the end of the session, he looked at me with a somber expression and said something I will never forget: "He's still there. But for now, you're protected." In the days that followed, the presence of the man in the black cloak became a constant in my life. I saw him from a distance, always watching, lurking like a shadow. He never got close, but I knew he was waiting for the right moment. Every time I saw him, my body froze, and a deep terror consumed me. Then the tragedy happened. A few months later, on a quiet night, my younger sister Sarah disappeared. She had been playing in the backyard, as she did every evening, when my mom called her in for dinner. But this time, Sarah didn't answer. When my mom went outside to look for her, all she found was the empty swing, gently swaying in the cold night breeze. We searched everywhere. The police were called, searches were conducted, but Sarah was gone without a trace. No sounds, no signs. Just the agonizing silence of that night, broken by my parents' despair. What haunts me to this day is what I saw just before Sarah disappeared. That night, while I was in my room, I looked out the window and saw the man in the black cloak standing by the tree in the backyard, watching my sister play. He was there, motionless as always. I tried to scream, tried to run to her, but it was as if something held me in place. My body was frozen, my feet glued to the floor, unable to do anything to help. And then, he disappeared. Just like Sarah. Since that night, the presence of the man in the black cloak has never left me. Sometimes, I feel his gaze in the shadows, in the corners of places I go, like he's always watching, waiting, planning. I know he won't stop. He already took away what I loved most, and now, I know he's just waiting for the right moment to return. The question that haunts me is, why did he choose me? What does he want from me? And the worst part, what will he do when he comes back? And maybe, I'll never have an answer. The days after Sarah's disappearance were a blur of despair and anguish. My mom barely spoke anymore, and my dad, always so rational and practical, now seemed like an empty shell. The police continued their searches for weeks, but there were no clues, no signs of where she could be. Deep down, we all knew Sarah wasn't coming back. Something had taken her away from us. Something that somehow I was involved in. The nights became worse. Every time silence fell, the weight of what had happened crushed me. I tried to sleep, but inevitably, I woke up in the middle of the night with a feeling that something was watching me. I knew he was there. The man in the black cloak. Even when I couldn't see him, I could feel his presence, like a cold, malevolent shadow hovering around me. It was about a month after the tragedy that things escalated. That night, I woke again at 3 a.m., just like that first time. I was drenched in sweat, and my room felt enveloped in an even darker, heavier darkness than usual. The air was thick, and there was a musty smell, as if something old and decayed was in the room with me. The air was heavier than usual, and there was a musty smell, as if something old and rotten was there with me. I sat up in bed, trying to control the panic taking over. Then I heard it, a scratching sound coming from the window. Slow, deliberate, like something was clawing at the glass on purpose to get my attention. A chill ran down my spine. For a moment, I thought about getting up and running, but something inside me knew that this time, there was nowhere to go. With my heart racing, I slowly turned my head toward the window. And there he was. The man in the black cloak, standing outside, watching me. His eyes, two glowing red points in the darkness, bored into me with terrifying intensity. He didn't move, but I knew he was smiling. I could feel the disdain and malice radiating from him, like a thick fog. "You can't escape, Caleb," he whispered, his voice echoing inside my head like a distant storm, reverberating in every corner of my being. "I warned you, and now it's too late." That's when I realized. He wasn't just there for me. He had already taken Sarah, and now he was coming back to finish what he'd started. The terror I felt at that moment was indescribable. My entire body trembled, my muscles locked with fear, and for a second, I thought I was going to faint again. But this time, something inside me refused to give in. I remembered the spiritual center, the words of the medium, and how he'd said that for now I was protected. Clinging to that small spark of hope, I closed my eyes and began murmuring the words the medium had taught me. They were words of protection, ancient prayers meant to ward off evil. I didn't know if they would work, but they were all I had. As I repeated those words, I felt the atmosphere around me shift. The air became lighter, and the sound of the scratching began to fade. I opened my eyes, still whispering the prayer, and saw that the man in the black cloak had taken a step back. His eyes still glowed, but now there was something different in them, contained anger. He was being repelled. "Do you think that will save you?" he whispered with a mocking tone. "You think your words can stop me? I'm not finished. Not yet." And with those words, he vanished into the darkness, as if he had never been there. That night brought temporary relief, but I knew he would be back. The medium was right, I had been marked, and nothing I did could change that. He wanted something from me, something I still didn't fully understand. The following days were chaotic. I began investigating, trying to find answers about who or what this man in the black cloak could be. But every lead I followed led to a dead end. I was becoming more obsessed, desperate to figure out why he had chosen me and what he truly wanted. Then the final tragedy occurred. One night, while I was still awake, studying some ancient spiritual texts I had found in a library, I heard a noise from the living room. A dull sound, like something heavy falling to the floor. I rushed to see what it was, and there I found my parents. They were lying on the floor, motionless, as if they had simply collapsed. Desperate, I tried to wake them, but it was no use. It was as if their lives had been drained from their bodies, leaving only emptiness behind. My screams echoed through the house, but there was no answer. They were gone, just like Sarah. And then, I saw him again. The man in the black cloak stood in the doorway, his hood pulled forward, hiding his face. But this time, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him, holding his hand, was Sarah, my sister, with the same empty, pale look she had when she disappeared. "I warned you, Caleb," he said calmly. "I always finish what I start." Before I could react, he and Sarah vanished, leaving me alone in the deathly silence of the house. Since that night, I know I'm lost. Nothing can protect me from what's coming. The man in the black cloak has taken everything from me, and now, he's just waiting for the right moment to finish what he started. But the worst part is, I don't know how he's going to do it. And maybe, when he finally comes for me, I'll never get the chance to find out. The mystery of what he really wants remains, but the only certainty I have is that, in the end, he always wins. And so, I wait. Story 8. It was Halloween night, 2022, and I will never forget what happened. Although many people talk about the heightened energies on that day, I admit I never paid much attention. Until that night. On that Halloween, the house was calm. Our daughter was already asleep in the bed next to ours, which was common due to the renovations we were doing in the bedrooms. Everything seemed normal, too quiet even, but as they say, it's in the silence that the greatest terrors hide. I lay down next to our little one to make sure she slept well while my husband, Lucas, got ready to sleep in our bed. I was already exhausted from the day and quickly fell asleep. I don't remember dreaming that night, but I clearly remember what happened to Lucas. He told me later, his voice still trembling with a strange mix of fascination and fear, that he woke up around midnight. He said something pulled him from his sleep, as if there was a presence in the room he couldn't ignore. At first, he thought it was a nightmare or his mind playing tricks on him, but when he looked over to the bed where I was sleeping with our daughter, he saw something that would change our lives forever. Next to my bed, floating a few inches above me, was a creature. Lucas described it in detail, as if every aspect of that vision had been etched into his memory in a disturbing and vivid way. The creature was small, perhaps around 12 inches tall, and it floated with a grace that defied the laws of physics. Its body seemed unaffected by gravity, and it moved as though the air was liquid, swimming around me in smooth, almost hypnotic motions. It was feminine in form, with long red hair, so bright and vibrant it seemed to glow in the dim light of the room. The braids of her hair fell over her small, delicate shoulders, and her face was of unusual beauty. But it wasn't a common or comforting beauty, it was strange, almost alien. Her face was small, but her eyes... oh, her eyes were enormous. Big, bright, and such a deep blue that Lucas said he felt like he was being pulled into them. Those eyes fixed on him for a few seconds, watching him as if deciding whether he was a threat or just another helpless spectator. The creature's skin had a shimmering pink tone, as if it had a glow of its own. It seemed ethereal, almost translucent, and Lucas said it lightly shimmered in the dark. Her small hands hung by her sides, as if she were in a state of waiting, a silent vigil. What disturbed my husband the most was that she wasn't just there by chance. She was watching me. Lucas was paralyzed, and I've never heard him describe something with so much fear in his voice. He has always been skeptical of the supernatural, but in that moment, he was powerless, completely overtaken by the presence of that being. He didn't know what to do. The creature, on the other hand, seemed to have all the time in the world. She watched me sleep with a disturbing calm, as if she were a guardian, or perhaps something more sinister, waiting for the right moment to do whatever she had come to do. That thing didn't blink. Her gaze shifted between me and Lucas, and it was intimidating, almost hypnotic. According to him, the room grew cold, as if all the energy had been drained, leaving only that being and its overwhelming presence. He wanted to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Fear immobilized him. When he finally managed to move a finger, the instinctive urge to protect me took over. He slowly reached out, trying to touch me, wake me up, maybe even pull me away from that creature. But as his hand approached my head, the creature turned her intense gaze to him. Lucas said he had never felt such pure terror as in that moment. The creature made no sound, but her eyes conveyed a silent threat, as if warning him that any sudden movement would be his last. Before he could touch me, the creature disappeared. There was no sound, no sign that she had been there. She simply vanished as if she had never existed. Lucas lay frozen, breathing heavily, his eyes fixed on the empty space as if still trying to process what had just happened. That lost look, mixed with deep terror, sent a shiver down my spine. The silence in the room felt suffocating, as if something invisible was still there, watching us. When the fear finally gave way to something I couldn't quite define, I saw in Lucas's eyes a bizarre mixture of euphoria and fascination. It was as if he had been touched by something that transcends our understanding, something that had marked him irreversibly. He woke me up with frantic touches, his voice trembling with excitement as he recounted what he had seen. Every word carried terrifying conviction, as if that moment was the most real thing he had ever experienced. Clara, he kept repeating, it was a creature, small, floating, with red hair, huge eyes, and no hat. The repetition of that detail, the missing hat, seemed crucial to him, though I couldn't understand why it mattered. As he described the creature, I could see the image forming in my mind. A creature that resembled old folklore, like a gnome, but distorted. It wasn't the friendly and harmless figure from children's books. There was something more, something deeply wrong. I knew, just by looking into Lucas's eyes, that he had encountered something that didn't belong in this world. In the days that followed, Lucas became obsessed. He spent hours in front of the computer, searching for images that might resemble what he saw that night. But nothing came close. Nothing captured the essence of what he had experienced. Then, he made a decision that sent chills down my spine. Lucas found a tattoo artist who specialized in fantasy art and decided to immortalize the creature on his arm. He said that if the image was etched into his skin, it would be a way to exorcise the fear. But what happened was the opposite. When the tattoo was finished, it was eerily identical to what Lucas had described. The small creature with braided red hair, the huge glowing eyes, the shimmering pink skin. It was all there, forever inked onto his skin. At first, he seemed satisfied, as if he had closed a chapter. But what I saw in his eyes when he looked at the tattoo was something else. It wasn't relief. It was fascination. An obsession that grew stronger, as if Lucas was waiting for something. What frightens me the most to this day isn't the fact that he saw the creature. It's the way he talks about her. Lucas is no longer afraid. He speaks with a morbid admiration, as if part of him wants that thing to return. Sometimes, when we're sitting on the couch, he stares at the tattoo on his arm for hours in silence, as if waiting for some kind of sign. And then came the sleepless nights. Lucas started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, saying he could feel her presence again. "She's watching us, Clara," he whispered in the dark. "She's here, waiting." I've never seen the creature, but I knew something was wrong. The atmosphere in our house changed. The air grew heavier, as if a strange energy was surrounding us. Sometimes, at night, I felt like something or someone was watching us, but I never saw anything. Only the tattoo on Lucas's arm, with those glowing eyes, staring at me in the dark. Halloween 2022 has never left my mind. It's as if, with each passing year, that night draws closer again, bringing with it a sense of urgency and fear. Lucas tries to hide it, tries to move on, but I know he feels it too. Something from that night left a mark on us, something that still hasn't ended. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I look at the tattoo on Lucas's arm and feel like the creature's eyes are alive. That she's waiting patiently for the right moment to return. Story 9. My grandmother, Helena, was always an enigmatic figure. She wasn't a typical grandmother. I never saw her knitting or baking cookies like my friends' grandmothers. No. She spent her days in a small shack at the back of our yard, surrounded by herbs and plants that grew wildly yet in an oddly harmonious way. People in town would murmur as they passed our house, whispering that my grandmother was a witch. And, in a way, they were right. Helena was a natural witch, a keeper of ancestral secrets, connected with the forces of nature and the mysteries of the spiritual world. Since I was a child, I traveled with her through her world of rituals, potions, and spells. The air around her always seemed to vibrate, as if she was attuned to something others couldn't see or understand. She used to say that witches like her didn't choose to be what they were born destined for it, bearing the burden of seeing and feeling what others preferred to ignore. My name was Monica, and by the time I was 10, my curiosity about what my grandmother did had already grown beyond what it should have. I helped her gather herbs, mix potions, and organize the mysterious ingredients she kept in glass jars on the wooden shelf of the shack. Every time she looked at me with her penetrating eyes, she'd say, "Monica, you have the gift too. But you must learn to control it, or it will control you." It was late October when my grandmother started behaving differently. Her eyes, which always seemed to read my soul, were darker. She would stop in the middle of a task and look up at the sky, as if she was hearing something only she could hear. One afternoon, while we were together in the shack, she pulled me close and said in a grave tone, "This Halloween will be different, Monica. There's a dangerous energy in the air. You mustn't leave the house without wearing one of the masks we made." Those masks were strange, made of twigs, dried leaves, and bird feathers. I never understood their purpose, but my grandmother always said they were meant to hide our human essence from the spirits that roamed on Halloween night. According to her, the veil between our world and the world of the dead was thinner that night, and beings from the other side came to hunt. The mask was our only defense. I listened carefully to her words, but I was just a child. Like any girl my age, I wanted to go trick-or-treating with my brothers. My mother, who always believed my grandmother's stories were just superstitions, insisted that I go out that night. I didn't want to disobey my grandmother, but I also didn't want to miss the fun. I put on the mask she had given me, a grotesque creation of dry twigs with hollow black eyes. It wasn't pretty, but at that moment, it was what kept me safe. My brothers ran ahead, knocking on doors and collecting candy while I stayed behind, sitting on the sidewalk. The night was eerily quiet. A thick mist crept along the ground, making the horizon appear foggy and distorted. The house lights seemed dimmer, and the air carried a smell of decay that shouldn't have been there. Then I saw something. A woman, standing on the other side of the street. She was dressed in a long white gown that seemed to float in the air. Her face was pale and perfect, like a doll's, but her eyes were empty. Still, I could feel she was watching me. There was something unsettling about her gaze. She walked slowly toward me, making no sound. When she got close enough, a scent of roses filled the air. "Hey, little girl," she said, her voice sweet but laced with something hidden, something that made my skin crawl. "Are you alone? Come with me. I have lots of candy for you at home." There was something hypnotic in the way she spoke, something that inexplicably drew me in. For a moment, I almost stood up to follow her. But then I remembered the mask I was wearing and my grandmother's words. Something was wrong. I couldn't trust this woman. When I tried to step back, she reached out to me, her fingers long, too thin, like claws. Her touch was cold, like ice, sending shivers down my spine. It was then that I heard my grandmother's voice. "Let her go." Helena shouted, emerging from the shadows with a strength I had never seen before. The woman in white recoiled, her empty eyes suddenly filled with terror. "You know what she is, Spirit," my grandmother continued with an authoritative tone. "She's protected. You cannot take her." The woman began to tremble, her once solid form fading, becoming a blurred shadow in the air. "I didn't know," the woman murmured, her voice now filled with despair. "I didn't know she was protected." And in the blink of an eye, she was gone, as if she had never been there. My grandmother pulled me close and hugged me tightly. "That wasn't a woman, Monica," she said. "It was a spirit, one that wanted to take you to the other side. The mask saved you. It hid your human essence and made them think you were one of them." We walked home in silence, but something inside me changed forever that night. I knew the world was far more dangerous and mysterious than I had ever imagined. In the days that followed, my grandmother told me that the woman was an ancient spirit, a being that fed on the souls of careless children who wandered without protection on Halloween. But what haunts me to this day is the fact that, even with the mask, I almost followed her. Something about that spirit drew me in a way I still can't explain. Was I destined to go with her? Is she still waiting for me, somewhere beyond the veil? Years have passed, and my grandmother is gone. But whenever Halloween approaches, I smell roses in the air. And sometimes I see a shadow out of the corner of my eye, a pale and beautiful figure, patiently waiting. And I know that one day she might come back. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like to support us. And more importantly, if you've had any supernatural experiences, don't keep them to yourself. Write your story in the comments below. Share your encounter with the unexplained, fuel our collective curiosity, and perhaps together, we can unravel these mysteries that linger like mist between the world of the living and the dead. Remember, the unknown is always lurking, just one story away. And now, as night falls, who knows what shadows might emerge from the darkness to whisper yet another true tale of terror.